Hi, everybody out there. It's Plastic EP with Chachi LaPret. We've got a very special VIP guest. Of course, we've got Michael, Lindsay Hogg, the man who filmed the Beatles in 1969. As I said, filmed everything for the movie Let It Be. Just an amazing man that's historically recorded everything. And I just want to say welcome to you, Michael.
Thank you, Plastic EP. I'm delighted to be here.
With Peter Jackson now doing the movie, and he's going to show your concert footage in its entirety. I mean, you're the man that historically has recorded the Beatles for life. How thrilling is this, what's coming up in November, a 3-part Disney series with your entire concert being shown?
Well, I'm really happy about it because when we made the original Let It Be, which we filmed in 1969, I had to cut out at least half an hour from what became the released movie for various internal reasons to do with Beatledom at the time and what the majority opinion thought about, should we have this in it or that in it. And also, I didn't want to have the entire roof in because we'd been going through some of the songs before and rehearsing them and getting them better and stuff like that. And since I wanted it to look like a performance at the end of Let It Be, because we needed an ending, and so that's when I thought about, let's go up on the roof. I wanted it to be more like a full performance, not a bit of this and a bit of that. But I'm really thrilled that Peter is showing the whole thing because he's showing a kind of the work in progress of being a Beatle, being the 4 Beatles at that time, and what was really going on in their heads. And as he said to me, he's really making a documentary about the making of a documentary.
That's really interesting. Now, back then, Michael, were the Beatles hands-on once the film was completed, or did they just hand it to you and say, you do it? We don't want to be involved? Because Apple's really hands-on now. Was Apple hands-on back then, or they just gave it to you and said, do what you want to do?
Well, Apple, as it is constructed now, is not like Apple was then. Brian Epstein had died. Peter Brown, who'd been a great friend of Brian's, was involved. But Apple was more at the time run by Neil Aspinall, who had started life as the Beatles' van driver. I mean, we all have to start somewhere, and that's where Neil started. He was a good guy. He was tough. He got tougher as he went on, because that became, as the Beatles all separated, it became a harder and harder gig. Apple, which is what controlled all their various properties, it was the entity. So they weren't. Also, the thing I learned when we were doing the beginning Let It Be is, for all the different talents they had, visual or imaginative, they're musicians. And so what they really wanted to do was make music. And they really wanted to then see what was going to happen to this album. And then they took a little time off, and then they made their final album, and then they broke up, and all the Sturmendrang which came with that. So we originally started cutting in Twickenham, where we'd begun shooting. But then we brought the footage to Apple, and the editors and I had a little room in Apple. Occasionally, one of them would drop in and say, "Can you show me a few minutes?" And yeah, well, that looks pretty good. Okay, good luck. See you next week, whatever. They were not particularly hands-on because they had other things to do, and they figured, well, you know. And also, we'd worked together. First time was 1966 with Rain and Paperback Writer. Then we did Hey Jude. Then we did Revolution, and so they sort of trusted me, and also they were the producers, so it was going to stay kind of like they wanted, even though they weren't hands-on. Then we screened a rough cut on the day that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, whatever day that was in 1969, and it was at least half an hour longer, if not even 40 minutes longer. And then John and Paul and Yoko and Linda and my girlfriend Jean Marsh and I and Peter Brown went out for dinner. Very nice. Didn't talk about the movie. And then a couple of days later, Peter called me up and said, "I think that screening went pretty well." Yeah, I said, "All right." And he said, "Although maybe there's too much John and Yoko." And I said, oh, really? I thought it was kind of interesting. And he said, well, let me put it this way. I've had 3 phone calls this morning that said maybe there's too much John and Yoko. Oh, I sort of got that message. And so they were, when we were in the middle of Let It Be, the editing of it, although there were stresses between the 4 of them, it didn't look like they were going to break up. It looked like they would sort out their differences and that they would continue. Maybe one would go solo and then come back. Maybe George very much wanted to test his wings. He knew he was a good songwriter. Previously, he hadn't been given many cuts on the album because they went to John and Paul. So maybe George would have gone solo. Maybe Paul would have gone solo, and then they would have come back together. That I think is probably what they thought would happen. But then because of some business choices they made, it didn't go that smoothly. And then animosities, which can break out even amongst the closest people, broke out and they broke up. But when we were editing Let It Be, I don't think they thought they're going to break up. And so what they hoped was Let It Be would be an interesting look at the 4 of them. The only time the Beatles had ever really let themselves be watched being rehearsing. And it would continue to be a Beatles movie, as opposed to something which was showing where the cracks were. Well, we showed some of the cracks, but no.
With the song list that they played, and I know the police station wasn't too far away from the Apple building, had the police not stopped the concert, everybody I've spoken to is so interested to know what songs would they have played before they were stopped. Was there a list of songs that they would have continued playing?
Well, I've never even asked that before. Probably, but listen, the way Let It Be came to be started with the Hey Jude video. And we shot in the Same Day Revolution and Hey Jude. And as you know, if you've seen the video, we got about 150 people to come in and sing along with the chorus in Hey Jude, because I thought that even though they hadn't appeared for a while, just being on the 4 of them when da 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 started, it wouldn't be visually sufficient. And so that's when we got the people to come in. Okay, so we did about 6 takes on Hey Jude. And after every take, we'd have to reload the videotapes. And in those days, they'd have to be a virgin tape. So it couldn't be a reused tape because it was the Beatles and they would take 10 minutes to get the sync and the pulse rates and stuff. So they were standing on their rostrum surrounded by 150 people. In the first break, I went down and we talked to them, anything more we should do. Second break, they're still standing there. And then the instinct from Hamburg kicks in and they start to just jam a little bit. That's okay. And then we do another take 3. And then again, they're stuck on this little rostrum. And then they start to play what they always go to in times of trouble is old Tamla Motown songs. You Really Got a Hold on Me, Mickey's Monkey, whatever. And so in each break, which would be about 10 minutes long, we had 6 breaks, they would start to entertain the audience and entertain themselves. They just weren't standing there. And it was the first time they played to any kind of audience since 66. And this was 68. And they kind of enjoyed it. Because, I mean, don't forget, they're rock and roll musicians. I mean, they're not some people who live in ivory towers, although they probably wanted to at a certain point. They basically are musicians who want to play and who want to communicate. Okay, so that was the first time they played to any audience for a couple while. So then when I'm getting ready, the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which, you know, is all happening around the same time, I get a call from Paul McCartney who says, "Do you want to come up and talk to us?" And so I said, sure. And he said, you know, when we were doing the videos for Hey Jude and we played to the audience, we sort of enjoyed it. We kind of got our groove back and thought maybe we would do a television special. Now, this comes back to Plastic EP's question. I think if they'd run out of Beatles songs they wanted to do, of course, how many of those there were, they'd have done what they did that day when we were doing Hey Jude. They'd have done Tamla Motown, they'd have done Chuck Berry. Those were the go-tos for the Rolling Stones would have done Muddy Waters or Rhythm and Blues. The Beatles were Motown, Little Richard. They'd have gone to that old catalog if they couldn't think of any of their own songs to play. So that's the answer to your question. I mean, I stumbled on other issues, but that's the answer to your question.
Now, Michael, when you certainly, as you said, you directed certain videos with the Beatles, and then you did Let It Be. You were kind of at the whim of the Beatles. You were in Twickenham. George Harrison at one point walked out, didn't want to go back there. You had to switch over to Apple Studios down below. And were you at the whim of whatever the Beatles wanted to do? You had to act quick. You weren't expecting to move to Apple. And so you as a director, I know you directed films and TV. Is it harder to direct rock stars than it is actors? And in the moments before they were about to go on the roof, it's been said that they were deciding right there whether they should go on stage or not and perform on the roof.
Well, that last bit is certainly true. Was it harder to, well, you know, actors can be a pain in the ass too. It was very, I mean, I've been around, obviously, rock and roll musicians rehearsing, certainly the Rolling Stones, certainly the Who, because I was closer to them, I suppose, because their managers were friends of mine as well. They weren't hard to, no, because it wasn't like a fiction movie that we were doing. It was became a documentary. Let me back, I'll come to your answer your question, but let me back up for a second. So the original idea was we were going to do a television special, which was going to be screened in those days, one of the only, either BBC, ITV, Australian television, or NBC, CBS, or NBC, when those days were many fewer outlets. Television special, some ideas what it was going to be. And then Paul, smart idea, said, listen, as well as thinking about the TV special, why don't we shoot some documentary material, get a couple of cameras, and just shoot what's going on. And that can be the trailer to the TV special. So the TV special is going to be this extravaganza, which is going to take place God knows where. And then we'd also have like a half-hour trailer the week before the Beatles, you know, rehearsing, making jokes. It'd be probably not unlike what Peter put out around Christmas time, just, you know, the Fab Four. But then there were so many, and not to knock what Peter put out at Christmas time, it was a great tonic for everybody after the year they'd been through. So then we never agreed on what was going to be the television special. Was it going to be on an amphitheater in Tunisia on the coast of the Mediterranean? Was it going to be back at the cavern? Was it going to be in a field? Was it going to be on a boat? And no one could agree. At that point, George was getting frustrated because he really was much more interested in the album, in the music, and probably in contributing some of his own songs as well. And so he got frustrated and left for 4 or 5 days. And then he said he'd come back if all the kind of talk about a TV special went away and they just concentrate on the music. I think, so therefore it wasn't like I was making a fiction movie and I had a bolshy actor. I was making what then had turned into a documentary, and I was going to, you know, I was along for the ride. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen.
Right. You're a fly on the wall. You're just
a fly on the wall.
Happening, you're taping.
Yeah. I'm a fly on the wall, or a wasp on a summer's day, you know, one or the other. And so then we go to Apple, and that's a totally different environment. They're much happier. It's much smaller. It's more intimate. Billy Preston comes and joins us at that stage. And it's like, you know, like there's a whole family together, squabbles like families have. And then a new person comes along and he's at the dinner table with you, and you're going to act a little bit differently anyway, also because he's a fine musician. So then I'm thinking we've got all this footage, well, circus, and what was going to happen to that footage. And in those days, there were a lot of rock and roll projects which got half completed. And then someone would lose interest. Or because these big musicians, they're very bright, they're smart, but they sometimes can go off on a tangent, think that's a great idea, and then if that doesn't fulfill itself, then they'll go to something else. And then the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, Mick and Keith thought the Who were better than they were. And Keith said if it was called the Who's Rock and Roll Circus, I wouldn't care, but it's not. And so then the idea is where we're going to do the reshoots of the circus, and then the set had been torn down, blah, 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 and everything like that went on. And so I knew the stuff we were getting was fascinating to do with the Beatles rehearsing, because after all, it was the Beatles rehearsing, the Beatles interacting, but it's also the Beatles playing with each other. It wasn't only rehearsing Long and Winding Road or Maxwell's Silver Hammer, it was how they were with each other. And yes, there might have been the occasional moments of tension, but don't forget they'd known each other since they were 14, 15, and 16. And they really were like a marriage. And they got married very young. And they had great times together. And then as they matured, because by that time they were 27, 28, 29, as they matured, each of them was looking for a somewhat different life. Certainly their artistic lives, because that's how they grew up, but they were also looking, I mean, Paul more liked to be able to go home for dinner, regular time to be with his family, very much a family man. And John was investigating a more bohemian life with Yoko, who was denigrated when she came to England because no one knew she'd been really quite successful in the arts in New York in the 1950s. George wanted to make more music and have more of his songs available to people. And Ringo did what the drummer always does, contribute partly by observing and seeing what's going on and being able to be a counselor. It's like Charlie Watts is with the Rolling Stones. I mean, he's been there for 60 years. And I think the reason the Stones are still together is because of Charlie, because he has always been the head they go to. He's very extraordinary, amazing guy. But the drummer watches. You don't usually get songs from the drummer. Phil Collins was the drummer. There was that guy in the Eagles who was the drummer. But mainly the songs come from the front line, the guitar players. And the drummer is the one who says to you afterwards, gee, why did you do it like that? Whatever. Anyway, so I'm worried that the stuff we have, the footage we're getting, may not be able to be put in sort of a coherent way. So I thought we have to have a conclusion. We have to have somewhere, at least I know something will happen at the end, which will look like a culmination of what we've been doing for the last hour and a half. This is a documentary. So we were having lunch one day and I'd had this thought and I said, you wouldn't do it at the Cavern, you wouldn't do it on the coast of the Mediterranean, and you wouldn't do it on the boat. So why don't we just do it on the roof? And they said, do what on the roof? And I said, a concert.
Wow.
And then after the lunch, we went up, several of us, Paul and Ringo, and we looked around, we looked at London from the roof, and Paul jumped up on the boards on the roof sometimes to see if it was going to take the weight of the instruments. And I always say, and Billy Preston's organ. And then we had to shore it up with planks from underneath because it was a very old building. And then we were going to do it on the Thursday, but the weather was too bad. It was too cloudy and it was just a dull day. And so we went to the Friday, and this is going to be in Peter's movie, I'm pretty sure. There's a lot of, yeah, well, we'll do it. And I'm saying, but I kind of need to know if you're going to do it because I have to get 11 cameras and stuff like that. I say, yeah, well, don't you worry about that. We're the band. We know what we're going to do. And I say, but are you going to do it up there or where are you going to do it? And they say, well, just let us work on that And this is like the day before. And so then somehow I get them all together in the little ante room below the wooden staircase, which goes up to the roof. And it's not solid. Ringo says, it's cold up there. I mean, he'd sort of been for it, but it really was a cold day. You'd see them. I mean, it's tough to play guitar anyway if your fingers are really cold. It's probably tough to play the drums too. He's cold up there. And George said, yeah, but what's the point? You know, why? What's the point? What's the point? We don't need it, you know. It's good weird being on a cold day in the roof. And then Paul said, you know, we've got to do something. We just got to do something. I mean, because he felt, I think they needed to circle the wagons to go on as Beatles, which of course he wanted. I mean, yes, whether they go off and do separate albums, who cares? But he wanted to keep the group together because that's all he knew. And also I have a theory that if you're a singer like Paul is, and you're used to hearing those harmonies in your ear, since John and George and Paul, since the time you were 16, you really didn't want other voices in your ear. You wanted to hear that particular cadence and stuff like this. So anyway, he's saying we really got to do this. We got to do this. But it's a stalemate. Ringo, yeah, but it's cold. Yeah, it's true. George didn't want to do it. Paul said, yeah. And then it's silence. And so John and Yoko are standing there. And then John says, fuck it, let's do it. And then that was it. Then they go up the little ladder and go into history. Wow. But we didn't know it was going to be the final concert. I mean, it was. But the great thing for me about it was that once they got there, once they tuned up and once they started to play, is they really loved it. They loved being together. They loved performing. You can see it as they exchange looks on the roof, or if one of them sings a bit off or something like that. The interplay between them is really like, you know, when George was 14 and Paul was 15 and John was 16, they went back. They became who they always were. And so, in fact, it's a beautiful ending. I'm talking about Let It Be now. And in Peter's picture, he's going to have the whole roof. So you're just going to get more of a beautiful ending. And also, I mean, you know, he's a very bright filmmaker who's used to dealing with enormous canvas, if you think of Lord of the Rings. And he has, even though it's only 4 people, and then the rest of the people who were involved in talking to them and being part of the whole story, it's quite a big canvas he's got now. And he's made the stuff look, he's got all that technology over in New Zealand. And he showed me at one point some original footage of Let It Be up against what he'd been working on in New Zealand. And in the Let It Be, we'll fix this too, but everybody's hair was like just lank. It was like it laid there like a sheet. And Peter, when he'd worked on it, you could see strands of hair. I mean, it really looked almost modern. And so you feel you're there. Probably when we put out Let It Be again, we will give it some sense of being an old movie because it's 50 years old, and we didn't do it today. Peter's will have a more up-to-date look, which will bring you into it in a different way. I mean, it's a very, I mean, I don't think they could have got, I mean, they talked to me about it. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go back there. I'd done it 50 years ago, and it was what it is. And I think it's very good. But I'm very excited to see Peter's 6 hours. I mean, it'll be fun for us all. And then Let It Be will come out. They're gonna re-release it in some form, whether it also will go into Disney or it'll be theatrical, or I don't know. Wow. But I'm very glad about that because, first of all, Peter will willy-nilly have some stuff that I probably wanted to use and wasn't able to use. But one of the things which happened to Let It Be was that it was released in America in May 1970, and they'd broken up officially like 3 weeks before. And none of them came to the premiere in England at the end of 1969. And a lot of people thought of it as the breakup movie. and we're sad, because no one wanted the Beatles to break up, although no one wants the first marriage to break up. But things happen, people change, they evolve. But everyone thought it was the breakup movie, and therefore, even though it's not sad, it's happy, everything was examined under a laser microscope of, well, did you see the way he looked at him? Oh yeah, but that you could tell that they really weren't getting on. Until they had the big breakup and the squabbles about money and management and stuff like that, they loved each other. But of course, people who've been together for a long time, of course they're going to squabble. Of course there's going to be some disagreement. Also, they're artists. I mean, they're not doing macrame, they're making songs. And that's a very intricate process. And also, does this person like, and also they weren't collaborating the way they used to collaborate so much, like when they were writing songs in Paul's bedroom or on the road. It was more because they were living separate lives. The songwriter would come in with the song and he'd give the others their chords, A, B minor, whatever, like, I'm not a musician. And so it was more like the songwriter would then get the guys with him, as opposed to the songwriting being as collaborative as it had been before. But just, to sum up my feeling, I'm really looking forward to seeing Peter's and then seeing my own one come out sometime after.
I've also got a lot of fans that have asked me, with the rooftop there at Apple, it's actually a very small space. And when you look at 1969, what you filmed and what you could do today had that happened, I mean, the technology has changed, completely different. I need to know, basically, that setup is unbelievable. You've got like a metal barrier where anyone can go over the edge. You've got big cameras. I mean, can I ask how many cameras how you organized, how you were going to get the angles? Basically, how complicated was it to work it out then to do the shoot?
Well, we had, I think, 11 cameras. We had the ones on the roof, which I'll come back to in a second. We had one on a building across the road, which could get us wide angles of the roof. We had 1, 2, 3 in the street for crowd, and also a camera specifically in the street to follow any police activity. 3, 4, we had 6 on the roof, I think, 3, 4, that's 10. And then I built a little booth with a 2-way mirror in the lobby of Apple, so that in case the police did come in, we would be able to film them without them knowing it. I mean, they probably did know it, but at least it wasn't a guy with a camera standing there like that. We had a little hut. So I think we had 11 cameras. And I mean, the problem was in those days, that kind of setup, you didn't have any, when I did the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, although it was recorded on film, the images came into the equivalent of a television control room. And so I could cut the cameras and say, make that a close-up or make that a wide shot over the intercom with me and the camera guys. Whereas on the roof, I didn't have that. So it was really kind of hand signals to my DP, Tony Richmond, who also operated a camera himself, trying to, so that you didn't all end up with a close-up of John Lennon. So it was kind of managing the menu of the camera angles as well as the stuff in the street. I mean, I didn't see the stuff in the street till later, but I knew the guys who were doing the street stuff, and we talked before about some interviews, some crowd scenes, stuff like that. And then there were the police, and then, of course, there were the people in the building next door who I think had a haberdashery or textile or fabric company, selling beautiful English tweeds and wool or whatever. And they were from the other generation. They were the guys in bowler hats. Well, I mean, rock and roll music is all right in its place, but I mean, I don't think when it makes this racket but people are not coming into our building, I think it certainly should be stopped. And so there was that divide between the people who'd been in the Second World War, who basically were the parents of the kids, because all of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, they were children of the Second World War. their parents, their uncles, or their moms, or whatever, would have been in the war effort in some way. And then when the war was over, then it came rationing, food rationing. You know, you get 2 eggs a week and 1 rasher of bacon. Clothes, fabrics where, you know, you could have 1 suit a year or whatever. And so it was a bleak time. It was a bleak time. And these kids who were getting their influences now from America, from, you know, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Muddy Waters, they were anxious. They were pulsating for the new world, which they in fact made. And so and there was still a lot of resistance from the older generation to the younger ones at that time, even against, you know, the Beatles. Rolling Stones, certainly, you know, would you let your daughter go out with the Rolling Stone? But certainly against the Beatles too. And so the main complaint came from the wool store next door. And that's when the police had to, because of the noise, come in. And then we delayed it as long as possible. Mal Evans went down and started to talk to the police, and they said, well, it's very noisy up there. He said, oh, I didn't think it was so noisy. Oh, really? We haven't been out in the street. I've been up on the roof. Oh, it's really noisy. Okay, well, I'll go and talk to them to get it a little less noisy. So then Mal disappears for a while. And then he goes down and said, they need to make a certain amount of noise up there just because, you know, they're musicians and that's what they do. And then the police said, well, we'll have to shut it down. And then Mal said, well, come up on the roof and see what you think. And then, of course, this young Bobby goes on the roof and, you know, boy, is he going to have a story for his wife that night. That's not going to be like booking the drunk at Bow Street Prison or something. And so then they come up and then they kind of negotiate. They'll play one more song. And that's when Paul improvises the lyric, you know, you can play on the roof again. Your mom is going to have you arrested. And then it was all over. And then, this is your lucky day. John Lennon steps to the mic when it's over and says, I want to thank you on behalf of the band and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition. I mean, if you're going to write it, you know, that was pretty amazing.
Michael, Lindsay, Hogg, how are you today, Michael?
Well, Plastic EP, I'm fine here in Hudson, New York. Do you get up very early by nature?
I've been up all night waiting for this interview. And let me tell you, courtesy of Chachi LaPrette, he only had 2 of these original 1969 books, and he gave me one and sent it to me here in Australia. And because we love you that much, we wanted to show it to you. Is this great or what?
Yeah, it's great. It was put together quite quickly at the time, so it could come out with the movie in 1970. But because it was put out quickly, there's a lot of chat between the 4 of them and me and some other people, and some of the who said what got misattributed, so that sometimes I'm saying what Ringo said or he's saying what I said. But when I'm saying what he said, I got lucky because he's a very funny guy. But now there's a new book coming out about Peter's Get Back, and Airmail, which is an online magazine, has asked me to review it. It won't be out for a while, near when Peter's movies are coming out. The original book was good, sort of a slim, couple of pieces by David Dalton and Jonathan Cott, good photos by my friend Ethan Russell. The new book, by comparison, is wonderful. More attention to detail. Peter Jackson has a piece about how we first got to know about the Beatles. Hanif Kureishi has a piece about what the Beatles mean. The attributions are good about who says what. And there's a whole bunch of new pictures by Linda Eastman McCartney. And they're great. And so the book is a solid reference book. It's wonderfully produced. And I don't get any piece of it. So I'm not saying this for financial reasons. I'm just saying it's a good book. Get Back. I think it's coming out nearer the time when Peter's 3 films are coming out, which is going to be November in America, I think. So I would think this might be out in October, but I know Apple would know what the deal there is. Chachi, why are you called Chachi?
It's a radio name that was given to me back in 1982 in Boston, Massachusetts on WBCN. And it stuck. Okay. My real name is Lawrence Anthony Lopret, a nice Italian boy.
Chachi is easier to say.
Yes, and more memorable. Ringo and I have spoken many times. He always remembers my name. But Michael, it is such an honor to speak to you. And I would say to you this, my friend, if you need one of these, I will send you mine because I'm such an admirer of you, my friend. And that's the truth. I will send this to you if you want it.
I will try to get it from another source, but that is about...
Michael, here's your other source, because I guarantee I will send you mine. And I got no problem sending you mine. So there's your second source.
It is more important for you guys to have these mementos than for me. I will dig them up somewhere, but thank you. It is the best offer I've had today since my wife said, would you like scrambled eggs?
I'm a great admirer of you. For people who don't know, is a writer, author, director, actor. He has led such a memorable life. I am in the middle of reading your book, Luck and Circumstance. My friend, the life you are leading is unbelievable. And you've met some of the biggest movie stars, Orson Welles, Henry Miller, Humphrey Bogart, William Randolph Hearst. And you say in your book that rock and roll changed your life. How so? With all that going on in your life?
Oh, yeah. I was a really... my party grew up in California with my mother, Geraldine Fitzgerald, who's a movie actress under contract to Warner Brothers at the time. She was nominated for an Oscar for her first movie, Wuthering Heights. And that's how, when I was a little boy, I met some of the people that you mentioned, who, like most people, they were nice to kids. Humphrey Bogart was very nice. Olivia de Havilland was very nice. Then my mother and father split up when I was quite young. My mother remarried. We went to New York. My stepfather was a very nice guy, very, very nice, very decent. But I didn't like being in New York. I wanted to be back in California. So I started to get fat, you know, like the kind of guy that couldn't run away from bullies. Plus which, because of some kind of miswiring in my brain, I couldn't read till I was 8 or 9 years old. So I can't be a baseball player because I can't run because I'm fat. I can't read. And so a lot of people thought I was stupid, which in those days, they gave you a little less rope than they do these days if you're kind of weird as a kid. And so then I was sent away to a boarding school, and that was not any easier. And then most of the kids played jazz, trad jazz, you know, not Sidney Bechet jazz, but like there was a guy in England years ago called Acker Bilk who used to play with a little bowler hat and traditional jazz and stuff. And it wasn't for me. And some of the guys played Broadway show tune albums. This is on the little record players we had in school. Anyway, I'm 15 one day, and a guy who's a friend of mine called Carter, his first name, he says, listen, have you ever heard, I'm in his room, we're having a chat, and he said, someone sent me this, and he brought out a little sleeve, like a EP 45 sleeve, and he pulled out the little record from inside. He said, have you ever heard of this guy, Elvis Presley? And I said, no, who's that? And he said, well, someone sent it to me, and they said it was good. And so he puts it on through the little spike or the little round thing that goes over the spike on his record player. He starts to play Heartbreak Hotel, and my life turned around. And I thought, finally, there's music that I understand. Like mathematicians understand formula, I understood Elvis Presley. And so I suddenly thought, wow. So then over the years, whenever I listen to the radio or get some records, it would always be early rock and roll, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis, whoever. And I always liked it. I always liked rock and roll. And so then when I was about 24, I was lucky. A lot of things fell into place at the right time. I was working for an English television company. I was about to probably be let go because I wasn't doing very well. And they found out I'd lied to get my job, that I said I directed more than I had. I only directed one thing. And then the producer of this show, this rock and roll show, this live television rock and roll show called Ready, Steady, Go, whenever he came out of his office, he'd fall over me. I mean, no matter what, I'd be, picking up a piece of paper on the floor and he'd have to trip over me. So he said, listen, the director who's normally doing the show is going to take a 2-week vacation. Do you want to take over Ready, Steady, Go for 2 weeks? Wow. And I said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And so then I did my 2 weeks. Roy Orbison was on, Dusty Springfield was on, Dave Clark 5 was on. And on the board in the office, there used to be each week the guests who were going to come on the next week. And week 3, the week when I was supposed to be off the show, it said the Rolling Stones and the Animals, who were my 2 favorite bands. So I went to the producer and I said, with all the confidence you have when you're 24, if you let me do one more show, I'll give you the best rock and roll show you've ever had. And he kind of liked that, since the people who were normally doing the show were in their 40s. And sort of thought they were slumming doing rock and roll, whereas I thought, this is, I've arrived in heaven. So I did the show. I think I did Shut the Animals better than the Stones because I didn't really get them for a while. I mean, I did, but they never was doing what I wanted them to do. And so then I got the show as a permanent job. And so rock and roll changed my life because I was the same age as they were, pretty much. I'm 3 years older than Mick Jagger, a little older than Lou Goldham, their manager, the same age as John Lennon would have been, the same age as Ringo. So we all were in the same age group, which was important. And also we all had grown up with that music, and that's why it changed my life.
Wow. Plastic.
Now, Michael, what a fascinating rock and roll start. And doing the clips for the Beatles, such as Paperback Writer, Rain, Revolution, and the big one, Hey Jude, which is their biggest song. I mean, it's unbelievable. My question is this. Is there a Beatles song that you taped and you've got it that has not been released? And I'm talking before Let It Be or after Let It Be. They may have asked you to do something for Abbey Road, for example, or the Beatles as solo artists may have asked you to film a song. Is that true?
No, but they, Peter Brown called me in whatever the year was, early 67. I think it was after Brian had died, and he was running Apple, and he said, the boys, as he called them, the boys would like to talk to you. They got a new album coming out. And he said, let's make it next Wednesday at 4:00. You come over here to Apple. And so then I don't know what it is, but then on Tuesday, he calls me the next day before and says, hey, I think we just ought to put off that meeting for a while. And what had happened was that Paul had met another director in a nightclub, and the other director had, because Paul's very interested in moving things forward and technical things. And the other guy said, well, let's shoot this video in infrared light. And then they did it, and it didn't work out very well. But by then they didn't do the video. And the sad thing was the video was going to be for A Day in the Life. So I didn't do that. Things don't always work out the way you want. The one I always wanted to do, but I didn't get, was Penny Lane. Because Penny Lane struck me as such a song about nostalgia, about your youth, and about always wishing to go back to it and not being able to. Because as you remember, it ends, they're telling a story about the fireman rushes in with boring rain, so it's very strange. Penny Lane is, and then they start to go into another bit of a story about the fireman, but they can't, because then they just can't get away from Penny Lane. And so Penny Lane comes in again, Penny Lane is in. And because it's the repetition of Penny Lane, which I thought, this is really them remembering their youths, which were so different from the enormous success they had as in their 20s. When they were teenagers, they were just like regular teenagers, you know, hoping to get a kiss from a girlfriend or make a little money to buy a soda or go to the movies. And that was what their memory was about. Fish and finger pie is one, of course, we all remember.
Well, I agree with you. I love Penny Lane. I still can listen to it a million times because it reminds us of our youth. But one thing we talked about in part one of our conversation, we talked about memorable moments in Let It Be, the line at the end, I hope we pass the audition. But there was another exchange. And I wonder, as a filmmaker, in this case, a documentarian, that you sit there and it clicks when you are filming the exchange between Paul and George Harrison. Paul telling George how to play. George is like, well, listen, if you want me to play, I'll play. If you don't want me to play, I won't play. When moments like that had happened during Let It Be, do those things click in your mind to say, I got to remember that because that should be in the final version of the film?
Well, that, you know, that's become a very noted exchange over the years. And a lot of people took it as, you know, like a line in the sand between the two of them. It wasn't really like that, but it was a moment of two musicians, two artists not agreeing, and there being a certain amount of tension, which I thought would be an interesting thing to show in the movie. And to such a degree that I could tell it was brewing. And usually the cameras were on the floor, just around shooting there and there. But because I wanted them not to feel the cameras were imposing on them and they were free to talk in whatever way they wanted to, you'll notice if you look at that sequence again, that I got the camera up in the grid to shoot down on Paul so that he had no sense of any camera infringement. And the shot between over Paul's shoulder looking at George, it's quite fuzzy, soft focus, because I got the camera all the way back to the dock walls. And so he's on a very long lens, which makes it a little bit fuzzy. So both of them feel uninhibited or not aware of the cameras. And so they can talk like they probably talked when they were 16 or 17. No, I don't want to do it like that. Well, that's all right. But I mean, because it was one of the really the most noticeable example of them having this discussion, it's only a point of view about music, as Paul says. It's like, you know, are we going to play guitars all the way through Hey Jude? It's going to be, we're going to do it this way or that way. Perhaps they weren't getting on as well as they got on in high school when they were there together. Perhaps their lives were changing. All those things are perhaps. But it was just two guys having a disagreement, an opinion difference about something to do with their music. But BUT, because the movie was released after the Beatles broke up, it was used as a signifier that during the time we were making Let It Be, they were going to break up. Now, that wasn't in anyone's mind at the time. All I was trying to do was show the Beatles rehearsing, because as we discussed maybe the other time, was it going to be a television special? And then we ended up with just this documentary footage. So my job was to show the Beatles rehearsing, which no one had ever done before. They'd never let anyone in there. And if sometimes their rehearsals were a little bit lackadaisical, if there was any moment of contention, or if they were bored, or if they were thrilled, or if they really were grooving and everything was great, that's what I wanted to show. And they weren't breaking up when we were doing it, as in fact, you know, they went on to make another album. Were they the way they'd been when they were doing album number 1 and number 2? No, their lives had changed so enormously. But the point, Chachi, you're asking about is, I knew something was brewing between these two guys. I wanted them to feel not surrounded by cameras and crew, moved it all away. This is the exchange which happened. Yes, I thought that's something which needs to go in the movie, but I didn't see it as it came to be seen. I saw it as just, you know, like two people having a disagreement. That's what that was.
I'm going to ask you, after Let It Be, and the movie plays and the Beatles have broken up, did you cross paths with the Beatles again, either by themselves or individually? They kept in contact with you?
Yeah, before it came out, and as things were starting to unravel a bit, George had called me up and asked, could I arrange a screening on a Sunday night in Soho? He wanted to bring a friend. But this was after the movie was cut and was ready to go, although it didn't go out for a while for various business reasons. So I arranged that, and then he comes in with Bob Dylan, and they watch it together. And then Bob Dylan walks out and gives me a little wave and a smile. And then I talked to George a couple of days later, and he said, Bob really liked it, but he sounded very relieved. Bob really liked it, he sounded very relieved. And then after the movie had come out, after they'd broken up, I did some videos for Wings, including Mull Kintyre. I loved the bagpipes. And then I had an idea, this is before MTV and before a lot of the great songs were committed to video or film, is to do a movie where all the rock and rollers were older now, but they somehow would go back to their youth and do the great song again. So you'd have Satisfaction from the Stones, so you'd have Instant Karma from John, whatever. So John and Yoko and I had some meetings in New York in a Japanese tea shop on West 56th Street about this project, which was going to be it was sort of on the backs of Mick Jagger and John Lennon, and would they do it? Yes, they would. For a variety of reasons, rock and roll projects are not always easy to set up. It didn't go. David Bowie was going to be in it. And then John didn't want to do it that year, which was 77 or 8, because I think Yoko threw the I Ching and it said it wasn't a good time for him to do it, whatever. Then I came back to England and then started to have success again, directing British television, Tom Stoppard plays, stuff like that. But to answer your actual question, yeah, I did. I had a good relationship with Paul and with Linda. I liked her very much. They asked me when their third child, James, was born, to come to the hospital and see what a cute baby he was. We had tea together in the hospital room. Mull Kintyre, talking to John about the project. I didn't see George much. Run into Ringo sometimes in California, when after Maureen and he split up and he remarried, he lived in Monaco too, but he's been in California a lot. His memories of Let It Be are not so positive, but I don't think he's seen it for quite a while. Mm. And I think he might have been reading about how they weren't getting on with each other. But in fact, and for those of us who've seen Let It Be fairly recently, they get on very well. Mm. And I'm sure you're going to see that in Peter's movie, because they got on. The thing to remember is they were like brothers. And the brothers can fight sometimes. I was reading a piece about two friends of mine, the McNally brothers, who owned all the restaurants in New York, but they had a big row, like when they were in their early 30s, and one of them punched the other one and broke his cheekbone. Nothing like that happened with the Beatles, but there can be sibling disagreements. It wasn't nearly like that with the four of them, but they changed, and that's what has occurred. The answer, yes, is the answer. If you remember the question.
Well, Michael, you mentioned the Stones, and through my years of knowing your work and watching your interviews, especially when your book came out, for years we've talked about the differences between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And you have said in the past that, the Beatles are a quote unquote different dish. Much different than the Stones, and even Mick Jagger called the Beatles the four-headed monster. But you found working with the Rolling Stones easier than working with the Beatles. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. The Beatles were more insular than the Rolling Stones. The four of them were, the wagons were more closely circled together with the Beatles. Perhaps because originally they came from Liverpool, as you know, the north of England, and it wasn't the great cosmopolitan London, it was Liverpool. Like the Animals came from Newcastle. These were tougher places. So I think when they came down south, the Beatles, and again, they huddled together. You know, this was London. This was the Palladium. This is where the Queen of England lived. And these are just these four little guys who couldn't get a record deal. And so it made them, I think, tighter as a group. Then the extraordinary and proper explosion of their music occurred, and they took over the world. And as Ringo said, only the four of us will ever know what that was like. So then when I went to talk to them for the first time before we did Paperback Writer and Rain, giving them an idea, which I think I said in the book, was kind of like putting a piece of meat in the animal's cage, that one of them would pick it up and maybe have a bite and toss it over to the other one who'd sniff it and think, well. And so by the time you got your idea back, it had been mauled and played around with a little bit like that. Not that they didn't go with the idea, but it was, the four of them had a good chew at the piece of meat before you got it back and before anything moved forward. So, but I would say they were more insular for the reasons I've given. That, you know, they weren't famous and rich when they began. You know, they were these four guys who just happened to be incredibly talented. Whereas the Rolling Stones, you know, Mick was going to the London School of Economics. They'd already been playing in clubs in London, in Richmond, in and around London. They were more rhythm and blues. The Beatles were more rock and roll. But and also in the same way that Paul, I think, probably became the go-to Beatle in later years, just because he was trying to figure out how to keep them all together. The go-to Rolling Stone for me was Mick. Also because he was very definitely the front man. Whereas with the Beatles, you had the three guitar players and Ringo. And like the Rolling Stones had the four guitar players, well, the three guitar players, Mick and Charlie. And so the one that I always would give the idea to, I call up Mick and say, here's what I'm thinking for Painted Black, that you put your hands up after every verse, we take out a bank of lights in the studio, so eventually it's you standing in a black space, paint it black. Where with the Beatles, it was more like you'd have to obviously you included all the Stones too. We had meetings with all of them, and they all had their say, of course, but it was Mick's was more the one carrying the ball, because he was the one who was going to be performing it more than Bill or Brian or Keith was. So I just found them an easier ride than the Beatles. And also, as Mick said, the Beatles were the four-headed monster. They're the most famous people in the world.
Now, Michael, I need to ask you, in the future, as you know, Beatle historians and everyone's going to look back on your fabulous, fantastic career. Now, I just want to ask you, as a Beatle fan myself, working with the Beatles, what was the biggest highlight for you? I know it's very hard to pin it down, but was it working on a video? Was it working on the Let It Be film? Was it being with the Beatles? I mean, when historians are going to reflect back on your career, what's the highlight you'd like them to remember?
Yeah, it was, I mean, when I first met them that time at Abbey Road, before we were going to talk about the two videos, I was very nervous. I'd met, you know, and worked with some well-known people at that time, including the Rolling Stones and whoever else, and actors. But they came with them came all that they'd achieved at such a young age. And the reason they were as famous as they were is because of something that they had done. Yes, they caught the wave like a surfer caught the wave, being on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 months after President Kennedy was killed. Yes, that everything seemed to go their way in terms of promotion, in terms of the gigs, etc. And then when you met them, you realized they were four really, I mean, how God arranged it, that he put the four of them together, is something we'll, have to check on when we go to heaven. They were, there was a cricket player who years ago came on the pitch when England was losing or Australia was losing, and he batted 100, and someone said, "Cometh the hour, cometh the man." Well, the world was ready for the Beatles. So cometh the hour, cometh the man. So I would say, not only did I like them, and after I got over the nerves after a while. Certainly by the time we did Let It Be, but I really, in a way, loved them because of not so much what they'd achieved, but of who they were. They were four extraordinary people, and now we have Paul and Ringo left. I mean, John's murder was a disaster for the world. And George's early death. I mean, who would have thought when we were doing Let It Be in 1969 that within 11 years, well, Brian was already dead. Brian was already, John would be dead in 11 years, and George, what, 8, 9, 10 years later, whatever it was. Anyway, so I guess the answer, I mean, like, and still when I see Paul or Ringo, there's something very strange, and I'm not going to say mystical about them. They're just normal guys who, use deodorant and eat their breakfast, But so the answer is, I can't put my finger on it, but it was an extraordinarily fortuitous thing in my life for me to not only meet them, but work with them.
Well, Michael, in regards to that, I do want to tell people your book is fantastic. Luck and Circumstance. It's out of print, but you can get it on Kindle. And I just love that book. And one of the things you said in the book, and this has followed you through your life, talent and beauty has always converges. That's the kind of childhood you had. You were witness to talent and beauty at your home, your mom and her very special friends. And then it kind of followed you and included the Beatles, because I think you may have referred to the Beatles as iconic, like comic book characters, Mickey and Donald and Jughead and Archie. And they're the Beatles, talent and beauty converging in one place, as you said, in Liverpool. God knows why. So, and that's kind of followed you your whole life, talent and beauty, and you've been witness to all this. What an extraordinary life you have.
Well, yeah, I was quite ambitious. I didn't know what for. I also knew I was not really suited to making a living in the regular world. My stepfather was a businessman. I didn't know how to do that. I mean, I don't drive. My brain, there are bits of my brain which have somewhere dropped out. Couldn't read till I was 8 or 9. I don't drive. I can't, I can judge like how far you two are away from me. I mean, one of you's in Massachusetts, one of you is in Australia. So I can judge distance, but not when I'm driving. Like if I'm pulling out of a line of cars and a truck is coming down a hill toward me, I will keep going and race that truck until something good or bad happens. But that's why I stopped driving, because that was my instinct. I don't have great instincts. I had no particular gift. And the only thing which happened is my mother was an actress. She said to me when I was 14, I was at home on a school vacation, do you want to, I don't know, what are you doing today? And she said, do you want to come and watch rehearsal? I'm rehearsing a play downtown, a little play. And so I said, yeah, I don't know. But I did. I got on the subway and went down. And then that my life changed because the world of the theater, which can also be maybe the world of movies or theater or rock and roll, is the place I felt like it functioned, because it was like everybody was wanting the same thing. Everybody was working hard to achieve it. There was a sort of community. yes, there'd be rows and things. I mean, I remember in rehearsals, one of the other actors made my mother start to cry. But that didn't bother me. I figured, the theater is the world of emotion, and she's having a little bit of emotion now. It's good. But in other words, I found myself in that world, and I didn't know what to do if I wasn't in that world, because I had no other skill, I guess. So, but I'm glad you like the book, and
it's great. And I'll just tell people, I'm sure that's your painting behind you.
Oh yeah,
because you are a painter.
Yeah, hold on.
Now, Michael, I want to say, being with the Beatles, out of the four of them, did you find the four of them always very helpful with you, or did you find, because of artistic direction from either two of them, either Paul or John, that sometimes you had to come to that, how can I say it, level ground with them? Like, who was more demanding, Paul or John? Or basically they weren't?
Well, they were good to work with. They weren't diva-like at all. They weren't like some movie stars or women actresses who give you a hard time. No, they were interested. And I'll tell you something that John said. I think they all contributed. They all chipped in, especially when we were talking about going on the roof. But John taught me something, which may be the answer we're looking for. Before we shot Revolution, which we did before we did Hey Jude, we did them all in one day. I was walking toward the studio down a corridor and then coming from another corridor was John. And so we fell into step together as we were walking toward the studio. And he was looking not his best, like he'd been up all night. His skin was pasty, his hair was lank. And I said, "Do you want to go to makeup?" And he said, "What for?" And I said, "Well, maybe they just give you a little color in your cheeks or something like that." And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Because I'm John Lennon." Now, I first of all thought, does he mean I'm so important that stuff it and let him take me as I am? And then I realized what he meant was, I'm John Lennon. I'm not an actor. I'm not Robert Redford pretending to be John Lennon. I am only John Lennon. And so if this is what I look like today, it's what I look like today. And so he very much made the distinction between him as a star, as a performer, and just a human being. Mm. And so they all were just human beings. Wow. Who had their own issues. But that struck me as very interesting, that he let the world see him as he was, as opposed to pretending to be someone he wasn't.
I want to say, Michael, Plastic EP and Chachi LaPret, we thank you so much for your time. And let me tell you, the world loves you. We can't wait for the Peter Jackson's movie. He's making a documentary of your documentary. And you know what? The world's going to look on you, and the sun's going to shine every time you get up of the great work and what you did as a pioneer with film, and what you've done in the Beatles' career is just totally amazes me.
Well, it couldn't come from a better voice than from you, so thank you.
And Plastic, I know we have a minute and a half left. I just want to do a quick thing with you, Michael, because as a child, you loved Little Abner with your doll, and I just thought that was fantastic. And because when I was a boy, I delivered groceries to Al Cap just outside of Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then years later, we saw Al Cap in a kind of a tough conversation with John and Yoko at the bed-in. But I just wanted to, there's a connection there.
What a link between us. Al Cap, Little Abner, John and Yoko. 7 degrees of separation.
I would deliver groceries. He had a maid in the kitchen, always baking. They had a big, like, wolf dog. And I was a big fan of Al Cap until I saw him really get on John and Yoko's case.
Hi, everyone. It's Plastic EP here with Chachi LaPret. And, we got our pal, Michael Lindsay Hogg. And every time we get together, we're here to have fun. And let me tell you, Michael, after watching the Get Back documentary part 3, I got 2 quick questions. What kind of cigars were you smoking?
I was smoking then, I think, either a Laranaga Cuban or a Hoyo de Monterey Cuban, because you could get Cubans in London then, and they hadn't put on the punitive tax they've put on in the last few years.
And I got to ask you, did you give the cigar to Paul, or did Paul already have cigars?
No, I gave him one because he asked for it. And then he liked that. And then he started to get smaller ones himself, more like cigarillos, because he was used to a smaller smoke, as they all were in those days, because they all smoked cigarettes.
Okay, last question before we get into it. You know the jackets you wear? Those coloured jackets now, with what Peter Jackson's done to the film, come up bright as. Did you buy them from the Apple boutique, or where did those jackets come from?
I don't remember. It was a kind of, well, in real life, if there is such a thing, it was a dark blue kind of blazer type jacket, maybe double-breasted. I can't remember. But I never darkened the doors of the Apple boutique, unfortunately.
Exactly. Chachi, go for it.
Well, you know, the most talked about people in the world over the last month have been John Paul, George Ringo, Peter, and Michael Lindsay Hogg. Are you surprised by how it's just engulfed the entire planet? And you've probably done 1 million interviews since Thanksgiving. Tell us what it's been like for you.
Well, yeah, I did more than I thought I was going to do, and more not only in the East Coast of America or in Australia, but in Germany, Austria, Bogota, Colombia, Ecuador, Israel, just everywhere. Partly, I think, I don't know, I think Peter's done some too, but it may be because of the time difference in New Zealand. I don't know how he's managed to do with the time difference over there, to do with the international people in Europe, what the time difference is and how it affects things like that. But also, I've got quite a good memory, so I don't mind talking about it, because the two movies are very interesting to me. One is Peter's Get Back, one is My Let It Be. And all the footage that Peter used in Get Back came from My Let It Be. And I'm interested in making the case, which is getting clearer and clearer, is there are two separate movies. And there's room for both of them. And Let It Be soon will, I think, have its own day coming. Listen, I'm a big fan of what Peter's done with Get Back, because first of all, it took him 3 years. It was being like, well, the Bible is quite long too, but it's a good read. and so I think it took Peter 3 years of really hard graft over there in New Zealand with this wonderful machinery he's got. And he made some sort of discoveries to do with his machinery, partly because he got an extra year to work on it because of COVID. And I think that's when he had time to figure out some of the audio questions which had bedeviled us all for 50 years. But going back to question number one, or number two, yeah, it's been fun to talk about it, and it's been fun to try to set the record straight and let it be. And it's been fun to talk about Get Back and seeing and remembering all those days again.
Well, you know what's extraordinary, Plastic? When you watch Get Back, you have Paul saying, well, in 50 years, they're going to look back. And here we are 50 years later, Michael. It's so extraordinary. And now you have the advantage of all this time that's gone by. And boy, you would never think that we'd be here 50 years later after 1970. It's pretty amazing to see.
It's amazing that this is what happened to it. Let It Be, which it was the genetic matter which started Get Back, was about to be re-released by Apple in some form over the last 20 years or so, but it never quite happened. Internally, Apple made 3 or 4 documentaries in-house to go with the re-release of Let It Be, but they never were quite right. They never fitted quite right. And it was only when Peter had a look at the material, and he's, Beatles nut. I mean, he's a nut in general, but he's a wonderful one. And he's a Beatles nut. And that he wanted to spend the time trying to figure this out, that it came together. Because they always had, they knew that in some way that Let It Be was going to be the cherry on the top of the cake of all the re-releases, but it hadn't, and it hasn't come out yet. But the plan is it will in 2022.
Now, I read you've been called the unlikely star of Get Back. How do you feel about that?
Well, the unlikely star of Get Back. In some cases, I think I seem fairly intelligent. And then in some cases, people say, I understand, because I don't begrime myself with looking at stuff which comes on the internet. Oh God, no. But as someone who misled the Beatles, or what was I thinking about the concert in the desert, that actually was a great idea, because it wasn't just hey, let's all go to the desert and put on a concert. It had a real concept behind it, but it just fell at the last post. It was, I mean, there's a sequence in there where I've got a map and there's a model of the amphitheater in Tunisia, and I get Ringo to agree to come with us, because he'd sort of said before he didn't really want to leave England. He thought we could do it there. And I said, listen, if everybody else goes, will you come along too? And he said, yeah, I'll come along. That's when he was, I mean, in the last few years, he's been rather bitchy about Let It Be. But when we were shooting Let It Be, he was the most, he was the funniest, the sweetest, the most unusually intelligent guy you'd want to meet. And I don't know why he ate the wrong cookie. I don't know. But he was great. So he agrees he'll come along. And I say to them, so this is it. This is a yes now, right? Because yes was a very hard word to get out of them. And then John said, as he was leaving, he said, it's a yes now, but we can always say no tomorrow.
That's right. And what I want to say is, with Sabitha, right, in Tripoli, what blows my mind is now, because I've seen your footage, I can't sleep thinking what that concert would have been like had it been there, or had you gone to Greece to one of the greatest amphitheaters and hired the stuff there. That would have been the concert of the future, concert of the millennium, easily. And as I said, when I'm watching the footage and George goes, oh, let's just go to a club and play at a club, or let's just play here at Twickenham and give out tickets, and then let's go on a boat. You are the Cecil B. DeMille, right, of 1969, doing what you did. So many cameras, so many microphones. And I'll tell you something, Michael, every single Beatle fan in the world owed you the biggest gratitude, because you got it all, and it's all on film. And I can just tell you, I was 11 years old. I live in Australia. I don't know what's going on with the Beatles in the rooftop. I remember that day when I got told the Beatles played at a rooftop, then the Beatles broke up. I didn't know anything. But now that I see this footage and I'm older, I get it. And you become a character in the story. Like, I'm watching you more than I'm watching the Beatles, and you got the cigar and you go, yeah, let's do this, let's do that. And then you go to Ringo, you go, you know, we're both 28 or whatever you said, and then you start calling the Beatles code names. I think you called Ringo Russia, and then you gave them different country names. Tell me about that.
Well, I've got a pretty good memory, but they all had different code names of European countries, Russia, France, Germany, and Italy. And I think, this is me thinking, that it might have been because we were recording it that they didn't want to go on record as particularly saying, this is what we want to do. So then in order for them but to say what they wanted was we gave them code names. And so that in the future, 50 years on, people wouldn't know who'd wanted to do what. That's the best memory I can make of it. Because, I mean, I know we had code names. And why you need code names with 4 people? I mean, maybe if you have 15 people, everyone wants a code name, but four people with code names. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experiment to call them. Well, Ringo was Russia. Christ knows why, because he's one of the smaller countries in the Beatles. But what the idea was, just so it's more than I just had. It started. It actually we started talking about it early on, second day, third day, and Ringo said, "Why don't we do it in the cavern?" And I said, "Cavern was great for you guys then when you started, but I don't think it can hold you anymore emotionally. It can hold you physically, but not emotionally." And then someone thought about doing it in a field, like in Primrose Hill, or maybe at the Roundhouse and then at Primrose Hill. And I said, well, a field is nice, but all it's really got is grass and trees. And I was looking for something really bigger because this was going to be the Beatles' return to performing, having a relationship with the audience for the first time in 3 years. So it wasn't going to be in my mind, some dinky little concert. And I took it partly from the success of the Hey Jude video, which had the Beatles and 150, 200 people. And everything seemed to work out all right, that the people were glad to be there, the Beatles were glad to play them. So then I thought, this won't go into much longer. So then I thought, why not try to find a place somewhere in the middle of the world, in the ancient world, where they, like Mesopotamia, where they discovered beer or wine, or Iran or Iraq as they are now, or Libya, somewhere like this, where there's a place on the shore of the Mediterranean, which will be great. And so the idea was that at dawn, with the sun just coming up through the ancient forms, Mal and Kevin would start setting out the instruments and the amplifiers and the drum kit. Slowly, slowly. And then over time, maybe you do a dissolve, the Beatles come out. Now it's like 7 o'clock and well, 8 o'clock for them. And then they start tuning up. And as they start tuning up, the music starts to go out across the desert. It goes out as little musical notations on the screen, like E flat, B plus, whatever else. So it goes out. Now, it happened to be a real melting pot in the world, that part of Tunisia. There are a lot of Arabs there. There are a lot of Blacks in different kinds of communities. There's an American service base nearby. So you're getting a big collection of the world there, plus the usual fathers, mothers, children, old people. So the idea was that as the Beatles start to play and rehearse, is that these people seeing or feeling or hearing the music will start to come toward the music. And across the desert, the old man with his stick, the mother carrying the child. And so that by the time we get to midnight and everyone is in the amphitheater when they're doing Along and Winding Road or Let It Be, the amphitheater lit golden with torches and the Mediterranean twinkling in the background will be full of the world. And so that was going to be the Beatles' return to concerts. That was, I thought, a good idea.
No, Plastic and I share your vision. Your thought is the biggest band in the world, the biggest band in the entertainment industry should have an event that's commensurate to that. And imagine what it would be like today if they had agreed to do that. It would be beyond. So maybe it was a little bit of humble pie on their part, but I think certainly it's more of being lazy and just not wanting to go anywhere but up to the roof or cross the street, a la Abbey Road. So we share your vision.
They didn't, it came very close. I mean, John was for it. I mean, because I think he was fed up with Twickenham, but he was for it. And he was the one who started to talk about the boat. We take a boat. Now, that was more elaborate than I'd thought of, but he thought of taking a boat, and we bring in the boat some of the fan club. I mean, so the Beatles and 100 of the fan club, and that's going to take 6 days going to Africa. I mean, the mind boggles at the logistic of that. I mean, who's going to eat what? Will the Beatles be cordoned off so they don't have to exchange autographs with the fans, or will everybody be in each other's arms all the time? Anyway, we were going to get there, and the boat, I thought we'd just all fly there and we'd pick up the audience when we got there, because I wanted the audience not particularly to be a white audience. I wanted to be a mixed race audience. Yeah, and so John was okay, Paul was okay. Yeah, I mean, he got it, and he would if the others had said yes, he would think good, because he wanted the Beatles to do something. That was what his agenda was. The Beatles were going to do something. Ringo kind of said, okay, yeah, if everybody else does it, I'll do it. So I kind of had 3 votes, and then George said, what's it going to cost? Who's going to be paying for all this? Which was an interesting remark, partly because they were getting anxious about money. That since Brian Epstein had died, and before everything which happened at the end of 1969, Alan Klein versus John Eastman, Lee Eastman, there was more money going out than coming in. And royalties were not being collected on, and Brian might have made some deals which might have been not as advantageous as they should have been. And they were, I mean, they had quite, luxurious lifestyles, Rolls Royces and Mercedeses and big houses in the country, and Paul's house in London. But they were getting, well, George, the youngest one, they were getting concerned about money, believe it or not. And but yet they still had massive record sales. I mean, Hey Jude was an enormous seller, which is the one they did before we thought of the concert. And so then George said, what's going to cost? And then that's the first little wobbly we have in there. And then that is what then starts to it was the boat, really, what it's going to cost, which hardens his position about he doesn't want to leave the country. He doesn't want to do a show of, of any kind. He just wants to go to Savile Row, to Apple, and work on the music. And that's pretty much what killed the show, the concert. And then what you have, which is interesting in Peter's Get Back, is you have everyone sitting around with George not there, sort of in the doldrums, thinking, well, what do? We do this. And that's when Paul says, and then there were 2, because Ringo's there and John isn't. But then they settle it as you suspected they would. I mean, bands are not people who are always getting on, God knows. I mean, look at the Rolling Stones, look at millions of bands. They fight, they don't fight. They have good days, they have bad days. They're all kind of like marriages. And so so then we go to Apple, and we sort of spit on a dime, and what was going to be this great, in my view, concert then turns into a documentary. And that's the stuff that Peter's got, which is all the stuff. And he also has the doldrums when we're sitting around talking about what we're going to do.
Yeah, and in that moment, it's just you're there across from Paul. It's Paul and Ringo. George isn't there. John isn't there. And then Paul just gazes out thinking, I think he's thinking about the Beatles breaking up, and he gets kind of teary-eyed. And there's a moment there. It's a very heavy moment. And you're sitting right there. Do you remember that? And what was that like?
Well, I think, not sure, but I think Peter may have extended that moment a little bit. Not a lot, a little bit. I do remember Paul, who usually was, I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing, Paul was usually the forward-moving one. He was the one who was driving the bus. But he also is a reflective person. And the last thing of the four of them, in my opinion, the last thing he wanted was the Beatles to break up.
Right.
And John was already halfway out the door with Yoko. George was halfway out the other door because they weren't listening to his songs enough and giving him his due as a songwriter. And that also has financial repercussions. That if you have an extra cut or two on the album, you get more attention as a songwriter. You also get more money. And so I think Paul did have the sense that they could break up. Now, I don't know why no one had thought, particularly at that stage, which they did later on, why they couldn't have Beatles records and then 4 solo records. I mean, Paul made Ram very quickly after. I think he probably made it before the Beatles broke up. George had a nice handful of songs. John did too, if he'd worked on them, because he's a bit probably taking heroin or something. And Ringo always, Ringo is a solid seller of singles, which then made albums. So they could have done solo and then stayed with the Beatles. I mean, a lot of people have done that. But I think Paul was genuinely seeing for the first time what it might be like if the Beatles broke up.
Michael, to have all the songs on the film that you've captured. For example, I love the part where Ringo's playing Octopus's Garden and he does 2 verses. He said, this is the song, and he plays it and everybody stops and thinks, what a great song. And straight after 2 verses, he goes, that's all I got.
Oh, yeah.
And then
that is such a moment of what you might call collaboration and brotherhood between him and George, who were, when they weren't being Beatles, they were exceptionally affable and friendly and sensitive men. And see George trying to help Ringo compose that song and Ringo saying, oh yeah, I get that. It's one of my favorite moments in the movie.
And even when Paul he's strumming on the bass while he's waiting for John, they're sitting on the other side, George and Ringo, and he's just tapping the bass, and then he starts the beginnings of Get Back, and the other ones are moving their heads, right, trying to get it. Then John comes in. I mean, what a moment to capture all these things, like George doing I Me Mine, like, bits of these songs where we see these fragmentations churning and becoming a song. I mean, that's never been before, how the Beatles actually work or how the songs come into their head. I just think that part is so amazing that you've captured everything on film now and we get to see something we never knew about. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, the Beatles had not been filmed very much rehearsing. I mean, maybe 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. And it's funny that on day one, when we were putting the microphones out, and George said, are we going to be recorded now? I said, yeah, we're going to see what you say. And he said, oh, I didn't get that. I thought we were just going to be making songs. Yeah, I mean, I thought, just like a fly in the wall, like any person who was alive in 1969, who was in their 20s or teens, would be thrilled to figure out how the Beatles did it. And then what you find is that they take, they have a melody, they have a tune, and then they try to fit the words in. And sometimes they get the words and sometimes they don't. And then they'll put in something which will scan, like John suggested, George, that he uses the word cauliflower, which will scan and keep the tune going, the melody going, while they come up with other words. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, that's, but remember, Yesterday was originally called Scrambled Eggs.
Yeah, that's right. And the great thing is when you're looking at this film, it's like you don't know what turn it does. And I'll tell you, I'm amazed when when George wants to quit the band and he goes, I'll see you around the clubs. And then we move to the footage of Yoko Ono singing Avant-Garde. And I freaked out because that's like a left turn I never expected. in 69, and that blew my mind. Those few couple of moments just blew my mind with John and Paul really digging Yoko singing. And they've shown that in 69. That would have been amazing too.
Well, yeah, that happened right after the lunch, that when George had said something down at Twickenham, which Peter has rescued the audio of, and I think I'm going to just quit the band. But then he'd come up when we were having lunch. He usually joined us at lunch. Lunch was, it was in the studio restaurant or the when I say studio, I mean the Twickenham restaurant or the canteen, you know, is chicken or pasta, that kind of food. And he would usually join us with the other ones there, and sometimes our DP, Tony Richmond. And he then stood at the head of the table and said, I'll see you around the clubs. And he left. John says, let's get in Eric. He's not such a headache. And then we go back to the studio, all of us digesting George having said, see you around the clubs. And then it starts with John and Paul and Ringo starting this furious riff, loud and fast. And then Yoko, George used to have a little blue cushion that he sat on the edge of the rostrum. And then Yoko sits on the blue cushion, taking his space. And then she starts to do her Yoko singing. And then it's sort of crazy because Yoko suddenly becomes a totally different character in the movie than she had been before.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the couple of quick things. I love the moment when you and Ringo exchange I love yous. I thought that was very, very sweet.
Yeah.
And then I love the fact that Paul is defending John and his love for Yoko. He didn't have a problem with Yoko being with John, it seemed like.
No, I think the issue was if anything, a cultural issue. I don't mean because Yoko's Japanese, though. I mean, all of them grew up in the north of England. And they were born, all of them, except maybe George, in the Second World War. And they then became 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 after the Second World War. But that was a rough time in England, and especially up in Liverpool. A, where it's cold, B, where it's not a rich city. And there was rationing in England at the time to do with food. You could only get 2 eggs a month to do with fabric if you wanted to have a jacket or something like that. How many bottles of milk you could get. But also culturally, it was North Country. And so the wife of the family was not expected to take part in the husband's work. The wife would be getting the meal ready for tea time when he comes home, which was the big meal of the day, before he'd go off and have a couple of pints in the pub, and to look after the children, to look after the home. That was culturally what they had been brought up that the woman in the household did. And the woman well, first of all, there weren't many bands early on in Liverpool except skiffle groups. And they had girlfriends. They had girlfriends who they'd go home and see or live with. But the girlfriends they'd come to the shows, but they wouldn't come to the rehearsal and the get together. Now, so therefore, when Yoko suddenly turns up beside John, they're dealing with not only there are 5 people in the room now, but it's just not what they're used to do with the relationship between the males and females in their group. And Yoko, for the most part, didn't chip in at all. I mean, later on, she chipped in more, but early on, she'd read the paper, she'd read fan mail, she'd do calligraphy, whatever. And she and John would whisper. But, I mean, Paul says later on, I mean, is someone going to say in 50 years the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp? Well, that wasn't what the plan was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, isn't it amazing? In 2021, here we are. The book's gone to #1, the Get Back book. The series now, part 1, 2, and 3. I'm guessing that's going to come out on DVD. Would that be right?
I imagine. I mean, they're not going to I mean, it was a massive amount of work for Peter with all the machines over there in New Zealand, and someone's got to pay for it. So I imagine there are going to be various ways to get some money in. Certainly the book, certainly maybe, you know, a Blu-ray, certainly streaming again on another venue. I mean, also because it's been so popular that and people want to see it again and not, you know, and study it and analyze it, you know, Beatles freaks forever. And so, yeah, they're going to make it work financially.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Michael, I want to ask you, with all the amount of footage that you took, if you can go back and remember, before you made Let It Be and the rooftop concert, did you actually have time to sit and watch every single hour of what you filmed at the time? Can you remember?
Yeah, we did. But one of the problems we had when we'd finished shooting and we had during the shooting was, as you know, in most movies, there's the clapperboard, which signifies when it's going to start. And also you sync the camera to the sound equipment with of the clapper. But we often would just turn the camera on and not have a clapperboard, or sometimes pan off what we're looking at and show the clapper over there upside down. But it was very hard to sync up the audio with the pictures. And it was one guy's very frustrating job to do that. And so we didn't really, we'd get it sunk up in bits. We really didn't get it sunk up for like a month after we'd finished shooting. We were looking at it as we were going, but then we probably took another, you know, and once we started to identify sequences we wanted to put together, we'd start to cut it. But it probably took another month to then look at all the rushes, the dailies.
Mm. You know, Michael, you're a fascinating guy. You're an author, a stage actor, the son of a Hollywood actress. And one of the things my wife, Stephanie, my beautiful wife, Stephanie, said, please tell Michael, first of all, I love the way he dressed in the film. He had great clothes. But secondly, I think because of your childhood and your mom and her friends, you didn't come in fandom in directing. You said, and I'm paraphrasing in the film, you know, if something's wrong, I'm going to tell you. So you weren't fazed by the fact that they were the Beatles, and you were honest. And,
well, I thought that was, interesting remark. I thought that was my job. So I thought my job was to say to the Beatles, here are the choices as I see them, what you might want to do. And then you tell me what's in your head, and I'll tell you honestly what I think, i.e. came up the cavern. I said, I just don't think that's big enough anymore. So, and one of the things was maybe because of the live TV show I did, Ready, Steady, Go, I was dealing with rock and roll stars and bands every Friday, all day long, every Friday. And we were live on the air for an hour on Friday evenings. And the people that I was used to dealing with were the Kinks, the Yardbirds, the Who, the Rolling Stones, the Walker Brothers, James Brown, the Supremes, the Everly Brothers, Roy Orbison, people like that on the show. And so I was used to talking their language, because I also loved their work and their music. But I very much didn't come in to want to work with the Beatles as their patsy. Now, a lot of people in those days wanted to kind of be uber groupies. They wanted to be connected to the Beatles. They wanted to smoke a joint with George. They wanted to be in the room. They wanted to be part of the Beatles collective. I didn't want that. I mean, I wanted to spend as much time as they wanted me to and think my thoughts, but then I'd go home in the evening. I had my girlfriend, and we'd have a nice meal and a glass of wine. And so I was very conscious that, like I say in the movie, you're the Beatles. You're not four jerks. And
exactly. Now, I want to thank you, Michael Lindsay Hogg. What a fantastic interview. Everyone's going to love this. And look, seriously, the gratitude of the world, We thank you for filming everything. So many cameras, so many microphones, capturing the Beatles. I mean, look, it's history and it's going to go on for generations to come. And Michael Lindsay Hogg, Plastic EP and Chachi LaPrette, we salute you.
Oh, listen, thank you. I'll take that anytime, but it's great to see you two guys again.